Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to be ranking all of the main tracks from classic Sonics and modern Sonic stages in Sonic Generations from worst to best. Now, just to clarify a few things before we get into the ranking. Firstly, just to clarify, I am not ranking the entire soundtrack and will not be looking at boss music, rival music, menu music, or any other alternative songs that play during a stage, such as the truck chase in City Escape Act 2 or the police chase in Speed Highway Act 2. Secondly, I am unfortunately not a music expert, and consequently, I'm unable to describe songs with any accurate use of music terminology. I'm simply just a bloke who loves Sonic and who loves this soundtrack. So I do apologize for my limited knowledge, but I hope I am still able to accurately convey my feelings for each track. And finally, as always, this is all just my opinion, and I would love to hear yours. Let me know in the comments below what tracks you love and which tracks you don't. And with all of that finally out of the way, let's get straight into the rankings. Coming in last place, we have Green Hill Act 2, one of two tracks I just outright don't enjoy. I can appreciate how there is at least an attempt to do something different with Green Hill, but I find that the result here sounds too busy, with elements overlapping each other in inharmonious ways. Additionally, I simply don't like how the main melody sounds here. I think a more rock-heavy approach could have worked as opposed to brass and synthesization. Let me clarify though that I don't think this is a bad track, I just simply don't enjoy it, especially compared to the rest of this amazing soundtrack. Chemical Plant Act 2 suffers from a lot of the same issues for me. The main melody here just struggles to have the same impact as the original composition. Now with this in mind, I do think the backing rock elements are very good, and I can appreciate the intro's attempt at building atmosphere, trying to capture the factory tone. There's some great ideas here that I just don't think the song commits enough to, and the main melody is the hook of the track for me, and it just doesn't work here. It also doesn't help that Sonic Mania's Act 2 rendition of this track absolutely wipes the floor with Generations' attempt. Planet Wisp Act 1 initially seems like a really odd track that completely fails to capture what makes Planet Wisp such a special piece of music. However, I can appreciate the track a lot more through the viewpoint that it's trying to be a Sonic CD Bad Future track, and that through the eyes of classic Sonic, Planet Wisp would be a very scary place that simulates the bad futures he experienced in CD. I really admire the intent here, and I think it was a very clever approach to take with this track, and it does capture the bad future vibes of CD, but in doing so it sacrifices so much of what I love about Planet Wisp. The strings are extremely downplayed and the gorgeous piano is completely absent here. And while I will admit it's counterintuitive to want every rendition to use the same instruments, I just feel that the approach here takes away more than it adds to Planet Wisp. Green Hill Act 1 really doesn't try to do anything fancy here, for better or worse. Like the level itself, it plays it extremely safe and prioritizes familiarity over originality. Luckily, Green Hill is a fantastic track, so in the context of Generations, this was the perfect approach to take with this track. Looking at it in 2024, however, I've simply heard Green Hill redone far too many times for me to really love this track, especially compared to the rest of this soundtrack. This is an extremely harsh criticism, I'm aware, and it's not necessarily the game's fault, but I am just very drained from Green Hill, and it simply doesn't have the same impact for me anymore. Let my next comment be a true testament to just how good this soundtrack is. From this point on, I believe all of these tracks to be absolutely incredible, and it was extremely hard to rank them. It feels so weird to put Seaside Hill Act 1 this low in the ranks, but unfortunately the track just doesn't do enough to stand out, and I wish the guitars had a bit more oomph here. They sound very muffled, as though they're trying to sound synthesized. I can acknowledge the intent of capturing that 16-bit feel, but I believe here it restricts the track more than it does reinvent it. Despite these criticisms though, this is a very good track, and Seaside Hill's melody always gets stuck in my head. The classic Sonic tracks of the Genesis era mostly play it safe, and I really do believe that's for the best, and in the case of Sky Sanctuary, the bass melody is so good that the track doesn't need to divert from it, and instead the use of drums to implement some bass and beat to the second half of the track really works for me. It doesn't do a whole lot here, but it does more than enough to be an amazing track. Sky Sanctuary is where modern Sonic's tracks finally find their footing and have some real impact, and this is far from modern Sonic's best. This track has a lot of different elements overlapping, and while Act 2 of Green Hill, for example, became too busy because of this, I believe this track balances all of these elements extremely well. There's really not much to criticize here beyond personal preference. Whilst I love Sky Sanctuary's melody, there's just other tracks that have a bigger impact for me. I complained that the guitars in Seaside Hill Act 1 needed more oomph. Well, Act 2 brings it and then some. I absolutely love the guitars here. They really make an incredible impact on this track and guarantee that the Seaside melody haunts your every dream with its infectious catchiness. It feels almost wrong not to have this track be higher, for I really do love it, but the remaining songs just manage to overtake it. But don't let that in any way undermine just how amazing this rendition of Seaside Hill is. City Escape. Our only track with lyrics. Well, except the small excerpts found in Speed Highway. This track infuses the game with that cheesy rock fun of the early 2000s Sonic. Unlike Act 1's rendition, this version really just tries to be a heavier and cleaner version of the original, and with how good the original is, I have no quarrels with this track playing it a little safe. It's just a shame that there's not enough level to enjoy this track before the truck chase song kicks in. As aforementioned, classic Sonic's tracks in the game's Genesis era plays it safe, and Chemical Plant is not an exception. It plays it very safe. Now, while I complained about the oversaturation of Green Hill and how it's mitigated the track's impact for me, I just can't say the same for Chemical Plant despite it being almost as overused. There is just something about the bass melody of Chemical Plant that I cannot get enough of. I utterly adore it. Now, if you thought the guitars in Seaside Hill were good, then you are not ready for Speed Highway. Wow, I am in utter admiration of just how good the guitars sound here, and they are awarded the spotlight for the entirety of the track. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the vocals though, and whilst they only take up a small portion of the song, we are unfortunately at such a high standard of music here that even these little things can make a huge impact in the rankings. Now, don't let that take away from just how amazing this track is and just how good those guitars are. I am a sucker for strings in Sonic music, and Crisis City Act 2 has some stellar string sections that build an incredible tone of hope lurking within the depths of desolation. This track takes its time with showing you everything it's got, and this kind of variation is greatly appreciated. The intro cannot compare to the rest of the track though, and I believe it becomes too repetitive before the track moves on to introduce the strings. But when those strings finally are welcome to the track, this music ascends to a whole different level for me. This will likely be my most controversial take in the video, but I genuinely prefer the synthesized elements of Speed Highway Act 1 over the guitar-focused rendition of Act 2. This track nails the blend of retro and modern through its great mix of synths and guitars. I just think there's a lot more going on here, and it all works incredibly well. Not to mention that the vocals are so oddly muted in this track, which I wouldn't normally criticize, but given my distaste for them in Speed Highway, I'm more so grateful for this odd mixing choice. Cityscape Act 1 could likely be called the most iconic track to come from this game, and it is a remix that feels so retro whilst feeling so modern. This remix is extremely experimental, and unlike say Green Hill Act 2, this experimental approach completely works for the better. Everything works here, and I would be genuinely concerned for anyone who could resist getting this track trapped in their heads upon completing the level. It is so damn catchy. I love it. Another experimental track that works for the better is Crisis City Act 1. I believe this succeeds in all the places that Planet Wisp Act 1 fails. From a storytelling perspective, Crisis City and Planet Wisp are the worst places classic Sonic has to learn about, and would view both of them as bad futures. This track puts the crisis in Crisis City without losing the track's original identity, and this track has my favorite use of guitars in the entire soundtrack. I find myself returning to this level more than the level itself deserves, simply because I adore this track that much. Rooftop Run Act 1 is just fun. It is a track bursting with enthusiasm and energy, and I simply cannot play this level without dancing in my chair with a huge grin on my face. It is by far the most bubbly track in the game, with some utterly entrancing strings. Sonic Unleashed has one of my favorite soundtracks in the entire series, and Generations does nothing but pay the highest respect to its legacy through two gorgeous tracks. Speaking of which, Act 2 attempts to more so replicate the original piece than Act 1's bubbly remix. Here, however, a much larger emphasis is placed on strings of the piece than the rock the original, which was a bold move given how well the guitars work in the original. But what did I say? I'm a sucker for strings, and this track really does perfectly capture that joy of blazing through the city without a single care in the world. And finally, my favorite track in the entire game, Planet Wisp Act 2. Planet Wisp is one of my favorite musical compositions, not only in the Sonic franchise, but in the wider context of music. Nothing defines the core of Sonic more than the battle between nature and industrialism, and this track manages to capture that battle perfectly with an expert blend of enchanting strings and impactful rock, complemented wondrously by the sublime piano. It paints this inspiring picture of churning machines tearing away at this beautiful and lush natural world of greens and blues, with the hope of the inhabiting creatures hinging on the efforts of a certain blue blur. I adore everything about this piece, and for me, it captures everything I love about Sonic the Hedgehog so effortlessly. And that's my ranking. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. As always, let me know your own ranking in the comments below. Let's share our love for this game and for this soundtrack. And until next time, have a bloody good one, mates.